Lawrence, a former trustee and longtime member of the library, the city's oldest, founded in 1754 by a group of civic-minded people intent on creating a public library that would be very useful as well as ornamental to the city. The intervening 263 years have made the library one of New York's enduring institutions. Please support our program. But the library is a mere blip in time compared to our subject tonight, yoga, which over the years has morphed well beyond its ancient roots to take on a life of its own into New Age religions, psychology, sports medicine, biomedicine, and cultures throughout the world. When the UN General Assembly declared June 21st the Day of Yoga, yoga achieved truly globalized status. Where do yoga traditions come from? Our speakers, James Mallinson and Mark Singleton, have parsed its development through textual history. Jim read Kipling's hymn when he was about 14 or 15 about a young English boy traveling around India with a holy man. At 17, Jim himself took a year off between school and university and spent 7 months in India. He's gone back every year since. His Oxford BA is in Sanskrit and Old Iranian. His MA from the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, or SOAS, was on the place of ascetic yogi in Indian society. His Oxford doctorate, a translation of 14th century text on key techniques of Hatha Yoga. He's been described as a polymath yoga expeditionary, as his various yoga-related ventures have ranged from filmmaking and exhibitions to judging and paragliding. He's published 8 books, all of which are translations of Sanskrit yoga text, epic tales, and poetry. At SOAS, where he's a lecturer in Sanskrit and classical Indian studies, he's been leading a 5-year European Research Council-funded project to chart the history of Hatha Yoga practice by means of philology. Mark Singleton is a senior research fellow on this project. He came to the project after discovering in Cambridge University Library in 2011 a text describing an early 20th century Danish system of dynamic exercise called primitive gymnastics. Picture after picture showed men and women in familiar postures, warrior pose, downward dog, headstand, handstand, everything you might expect in a manual of yoga asana. Discovering this text led Mark to look at the roots of his own yoga practices. At Cambridge, in 2002, Mark was a research assistant at Durham's Hinduja Institute of Indic Research and went on to complete his doctorate at Cambridge's Faculty of Divinity. Then he taught for 7 years at St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico, later moving to Jodhpur, India, as a research scholar at the American Institute of Indian Studies. He's the author of 3 previous books about yoga. Tonight we'll hear from 2 of the world's leading experts about the role of yoga, past and present. Please join me in welcoming Jim Mallinson and Mark Singleton, who will be in conversation with Daniel Simpson.
Hopefully this is working. Let's just start by putting a little bit of flesh on the bones of the introduction and introducing you to some of Jim and Mark's work. Start with Mark, who's specialised really in looking at modern yoga, the kind of yoga that we might recognise a bit more readily. But he has started to look further back into time as well to make sense of some of what he was studying in the more recent era. So Mark, if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to be working with Jim on a project about the roots of yoga.
This is on.
Yep.
So yeah, as you say, I've worked mostly on the modern history of yoga. So that means what yoga has become in the last 150 years or so since it's left India and started to travel around the world. And closer, how's that?
Very good.
Okay, very good. so yes, that sort of those modern forms of yoga that we see all around us here in New York, that we see in London, those were my focus for quite a long time. And I've been looking at the ways that these yogas have transformed in dialogue with other sort of philosophies, other outlooks on what it is to be human, let's say, other kind of technologies of the body that have made yoga into something arguably quite different than it was in India and in the recent and the not so recent past. At a certain point, I thought it would be useful and necessary to also start looking back at older traditions, and I sort of had in my mind an idea for a book very much like this one that would present a kind of primary sources. So not a book about yoga, not a book by say, an academic about what yoga really is, but a book that presented yoga in the words of its own practitioners, because there really wasn't anything like that out there, and I thought who better to work with than Jim. And so about, 6 years ago, in fact, last time we were, it was after another trip to the United States, I suggested to Jim that we put this book together. And I was looking through my emails the other day where I was blithely sort of suggesting that we would do this it would take us a year, very easy to do. And then 5 years later we were still going. But that's really how I came to this book.
So Jim, you've really come at it from the other direction. I mean, wandering around India with dreadlocked holy man who grown your own dreadlocks, obviously, as well, and really living the life of the yogi as it seems to have been since time immemorial. So you perhaps come at this from the other end of history. Could you tell us a little bit about your own background intellectually and academically?
Yeah, that's quite right. First, I'd just like to say thanks very much to Jenny for the kind introduction and for putting this on. I've not been here before, and what a wonderful venue. It's a delight to be here. And thanks to Sarah also for organising it. So yes, that's absolutely true. And as Jenny said, when I was, everyone hear me okay? We've got it in the right place? When I was, after I left school and before I went to university, I came to India for 7 months. And it was actually near the end of that trip that I had my first sort of, I fell in with a bunch of these wandering yogis in Kashmir, and they were about to go on this pilgrimage up this mountain, and I had they have this sort of a kind of roguish sort of vagabond style wandering ascetics, and at the same time they have these this incredibly these technologies of the body, as Mark would put it, and that I think it was from then on, every time I came back to India, I would search these people out, these yogis out, and I think it was the 3rd year after that when I came back, so I was sort of near the end of my undergrad degree. I realised that if I really wanted to get a good understanding of this world, I would need to become part of one of their actual traditions. So I went to one of these huge festivals where there are millions and millions of, the last one, they reckon 100 million people turned up at this Kumbh Mela festival. And they were a bit smaller in those days, 20, 25 years ago, but I went there with the intention of finding a guru, basically, and getting initiated into one of these lineages, and that's a long story in itself, but it worked out very well indeed. I was very lucky to end up with this charismatic guru who was renowned for his mastery of various yoga practices. And so, but I'm unfortunately, unlike these yogis in India, well, unfortunately or fortunately, I'm not sure, I'm not able to abandon the sort of life of the mind completely, and I'm a scholar. I'm constantly questioning what's going on, why they were doing these things, what the historical context was, just trying to understand their whole world. And so I would keep the two parallel worlds going on of living with these yogi traditions in India and then studying them through scholarly methods back in England. And so after my BA, which was in Sanskrit, in which I wasn't able to sort of focus on that world at all, but it gave me very good language training, I then decided to do a MA in anthropology, so that would sort of justify going back for more fieldwork trips to hang out with the yogis. And that was great, actually. That was at SOAS, and I love that. And that's when I really kind of got inspired and decided I wanted to be an academic. But I didn't, in those days, that was the early 90s, and anthropology was particularly bogged down in theory, and it was a sort of nightmare. You spent much more time studying the theory of the methods that you're doing rather than what you actually wanted to study. So I decided, I turned my back on that, and for my PhD I decided to go back and use my Sanskrit skills to study this world of the wandering holy men. And the only texts in Sanskrit of any real relevance to that world that I was part of were the ones on yoga, on physical yoga practices. And so I decided to edit, to do a critical edition of a text called the Khichdi Vidya, which is about this very esoteric yoga method where you turn your tongue back into the cavity above your palate in order to supposedly drink the nectar of immortality, which is dripping down from the top of your cranium, and it's also a sort of rocket fuel because it's also meant to give you the ability to fly. And by complete coincidence, that was the time when I started learning to paraglide, but that's another story altogether. That worked better for me, actually. I did learn the technique, the yogic technique, but that never got me off the ground.
If I could just jump in there, Jim. I mean, that's a very different kind of yoga to what most people are used to seeing in lycra pants. Perhaps we should start by just defining yoga. And the back cover of the book points out in a quotation from the yoga text that yoga is to be known through yoga. So it is both the means and the end. Then there are in the first chapter, I think, 61 extracts defining various different kinds of yoga, several of which contradict each other. So perhaps you could start, Mark, by putting a little bit of context into that mix of what exactly is yoga.
Indeed. Well, I think today when we talk about doing yoga, we have certain images come to mind, like lycra pants, but certainly it's something that you would do, whereas in most of the texts that we look at, the word yoga is referring actually to a particular state, or to the goal that's to be achieved by doing these practices, like posture, like breathing practices, and lots of other practices that we go through in the book. And so yoga is the place that you get to. It's a place of refined cognitive awareness, but that in itself is not agreed upon. So the first chapter of the book gives these definitions. The final chapter of the book talks about these various states that are called liberation or isolation, wherein you're sort of somehow removed from mundane existence. Through these practices, you come out of your conventional identity, your conventional perception of reality, into these higher states. But of course, nobody can agree on exactly what these higher states are because they're so difficult to talk about, or perhaps because there isn't a single final state that everybody gets to. So anyway, that's what yoga generally means. It's talking about this sort of the higher reaches of consciousness.
And in terms of the yogis you were spending time with, Jim, what were their actual practices? I've seen, certainly at gatherings of sadhus in India, all kinds of contortions of the body that are similar to what we see in a postural yoga class, but people seem to hold them for a very long time, like 40 years.
That's very true. And yes, I mean, some of our earliest references to these postures that people do. I think we have the passage in the book from Strabo's Geography, so in ancient Greek, and he talks about how Alexander the Great met these, they were called gymnosophists, sort of naked philosophers, somewhere in what's now Punjab in India, Pakistan, and they would hold these very difficult postures. They would do it just for the day. You know, they would apparently come out of the town, go to some grove, and then assume a difficult posture, and hold it all the way through the day, and in the evening go back. But yes, we also, from pretty early on, get reports of people, as you say, holding their arms up in the air for years on end, or standing up for years on end, and so forth. And that seems to me to be one of the big differences between how the yoga that we see today globally. Although what I want to stress as well that there's not like a complete disjunction, and we do see within India, and I think we show this in the book, that that there are forerunners also to this sort of the physical posture routines that we would recognise as yoga as well. But that's a sort of different stream from the classical ascetic yogi who is basically turning his back on the world. I mean, today we see, yoga is kind of sometimes taught as a quick fix. You can do your couple of sessions a week, and that will make you work better. And that'll fit into your make your busy schedule sort of run more smoothly. But it's where it originated amongst these ascetics, that's quite it's a completely different world. They're absolutely not going to work. They don't have jobs. They don't have families. They've turned their backs on ordinary life, and the practices that they will undertake, in particular these sort of difficult, these extreme austerities, they are tied in with the mental practices of yoga. But they're thought to create this power within the body. And there are plenty of stories, myths, Indian Sanskrit myths, and again I think we have one or two in the book where, I think we have several hundred passages in there, and as it was a 5-year process, I can't actually remember everything that's in there. So through doing these difficult, these very extreme austerities, the yogis will build great power. And then the gods become sort of nervous about how they're going to become more powerful than they are, and they will try to distract them, or they'll give them whatever they want and ask them to stop, or sometimes if that doesn't work, they'll send some nymph to seduce them, because that's a foolproof way. Well, it's not foolproof, but if the nymph succeeds, then they will definitely lose their power. So this idea of gaining power as well as gaining liberation that Mark was talking about, these kind of higher mental states, is key to understanding of yoga and its sort of traditional formulations.
Let's turn a little bit to some of the texts in the book. As you say, there are a vast number of texts quoted here, and most people, if you were to ask them to mention a text on yoga, might perhaps refer to, if they were talking about a book with lots of colour photos of stretching, they might talk about the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, or perhaps even the Bhagavad Gita or some of the Upanishads. What would they not be hearing that some of these texts are talking about if they were just to listen to what they found in the more popular yoga texts?
Well, maybe let's start with the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. For example, that's often quoted as a kind of foundational text of yoga practice. Everybody knows it, and it's often taught in teacher trainings. There are, I think there've been more translations of the Yoga Sutras in the past sort of 10 or 15 years than there have in the past 2,000 years. But there are many things that we see practiced later that don't appear in the Yoga Sutras. So, for instance, there's only a few very terse verses on postures, and a very limited number of postures are actually taught in there. So, if you're expecting to find an account of why yoga contains so many postures, and indeed is identified with posture often these days, you won't find it in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. So each of these texts, that's not to say that the Yoga Sutras isn't a central text and that it hasn't been important all the way through that, the history of yoga, and that it hasn't been, that particularly this eightfold path hasn't been incorporated into many different systems of yoga. But it doesn't describe everything. It doesn't account for that history. And I hope that's sort of what we've done in the book, is to sort of provide an archaeology, to sort of show the way that these particular practices actually continue to develop and indeed to proliferate. So that what you have in 500 CE is not quite the same thing as you have in 1800. The Bhagavad Gita, just to comment briefly, presents a kind of yoga that is at the time fairly unique. It starts its own tradition, which is quite different from the kind of renounced traditions that Jim was just speaking of. For example, it speaks of bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion. So all you need to do as a practitioner of yoga in the Bhagavad Gita is to turn your mind and your heart to Krishna, to the ultimate, to God. And that's unusual. That's a kind of unusual move that then becomes very popular. And as we know, the Bhagavad Gita is one of the key texts of Hinduism. It's extremely popular, but it's sort of again quite far from the mainstream. So to think that we'll find those practices in the Bhagavad Gita would be wrong in some ways.
I mean, again, it just teaches how to sit, doesn't it? It doesn't teach any postures.
There are instructions on how to sit, yeah, but mainly what you want to do is sort of, devote your actions and your life to the Lord, to God.
Jim, thinking about some of the Hatha Yoga texts that come a bit later, what's missing if one was only to look at, say, the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, as it's popularly known, or Hatha Pradipika? Is that an effective guide to what's in some of the other texts that you've isolated here that were the source texts for that?
Yes, absolutely. One of the points I think we make in the introduction to the book is that scholarship on yoga and the history of yoga until recently has just looked at 2 or 3 texts. One of them is this text called the Hatha Pradipika, which Daniel mentioned, which was written, or I say written, is actually compiled in about the 15th century, so not that long ago, 600 years ago, middle of the 15th century. But what it is, and that is, so it's the Hatha Pradipika, that means the lamp on Hatha, and Hatha is the Sanskrit word that's used to denote physical forms of yoga practice. But what it's doing, that text, is we've identified now about at least 20 texts that it just borrows from, so it's like a compilation, it cobbles it all together, and it's kind of incoherent. They'll give different reasons for doing the same practice, and it's very hard to make sense of. So what we've been doing, a key part of our work, and this project that Mark and I are working on at the moment, central to that is we're producing editions and translations of 10 texts, of which I think 6 or 7 were used in the compilation of the Hatha Pradipika. And those individual texts actually present a coherent yoga practice, which you can understand. These later texts, which are kind of cobbled together compilations, are very, very confusing. So that's one of the things we're trying to do. I say those texts they're coherent, but they're pretty esoteric practices as well. Some of them, it's not always absolutely straightforward what's going on in there either.
One of them that I heard you talk about recently, obviously, sprung a few surprises for you as well, in that it suggested a slightly different origin for some of these practices.
Yeah, that's one of the most exciting things of our recent research, and it was long ago, just before we kind of finalised the book, we were able to get this into the book. And so the project that we're working on, we're editing from manuscripts 10 texts on physical yoga, so they range from about the 11th to the 19th century. And the first one is a text called the Amrita Siddhi, which means something like the attainment of immortality or something like that. And I've been reading this text from manuscripts for about 15 years. I've got some 17th, 18th century manuscripts from Rajasthan, and it became immediately apparent that it's a foundational key text for understanding physical yoga. It's quoted in that the text I mentioned earlier, the Light on Hatha. But then a couple of years ago, I got hold of, it's a very complicated history, I got hold of scans of printouts from a microfilm of a manuscript that was in Beijing, has now apparently gone back to Tibet, may never be found again. But a scholar from Harvard, Leonard van der Kuip, in the 90s, he, through various nefarious deeds in Beijing, managed to get these microfilm printouts. And this manuscript is absolutely fascinating. Bilingual Sanskrit and Tibetan, and then it has it has three registers of writing. You've got the Sanskrit, and then you've got the Sanskrit and Tibetan script, and then you've got a translation in Tibetan. And I don't know Tibetan, but I've been reading it with a scholar in Oxford, a young scholar, Peter Santo, and we're doing an edition of the text, and he's absolutely brilliant at Tibetan. And as we read this text, as we read this manuscript, it became more and more apparent that the text was written by Buddhists. Okay, and the general assumption about yoga and physical yoga in particular, that it's come from Hindu traditions. Now, actually, I mean, I don't want to labour this point too much because these kind of categories of Hindu and Buddhist we see as rather more distinct than they were then. 1,000 years ago, there was a much more kind of easy interplay between the two. But this has then opened up this whole new world to me. I'm now having to educate myself rapidly in Tantric Buddhism, which is a whole different subject and extremely esoteric and good fun. But yeah, that's one of the big revelations, and we do get that into the book, I think, just about.
And it's not just Buddhism as well, is it? There are quotations also from Islamic sources and then Jain texts as well. So yoga is actually a lot more diverse and non-sectarian than certainly people in the Indian government might like to claim today.
That's true, and that's the point we try to make, that it's a sort of technology that can be adopted by... So yeah, we make the point that there's no yoga philosophy, and that the practices, the techniques of yoga can be used within any metaphysical, philosophical outlook. And just to pick up on the point about the Islamic texts, I mean, they don't appear until the 14th or 15th century, but they were clearly very, very interested in these. There was a lot of crossover between Sufis and yogis, and the earliest paintings we have of yoga postures are in illustrations to a Persian manuscript about yoga, which also goes into much more detail about the practices than any of the Sanskrit manuscripts we've got.
Coming a little bit closer to the present, Mark, I mean, a lot of your work has looked at cultural exchange and also this trend that we see in the tradition of borrowing, copying, changing things, rearranging, and yet at the same time it's not quite clear how we got from this increasing proliferation of postures in the text to what we see today where there are sequenced postures, people putting together a practice, linking postures together. Has there been any discoveries that might shed some light on how we got from one to the other?
Well, the final text that we're working on at the moment, and that we've included extracts from in the text, is in the book, is a text called the Hatha Abhyasa Paddhati, so a kind of instruction book on the practice of Hatha. And it's probably late 18th century. So it's our colleague Jason Birch who found this manuscript in a library in Pune, and it describes, probably for the first time, sequences, or at least groupings, 6 groups of postures, some of which are intended to be practiced one after the other. It's very clear that there's sort of these groups of postures. So prior to this, all you usually have is lists of postures, and those lists might be quite long. There are texts that contain many postures. But the question has always been, like, why sort of, in the modern period have there been, is there such an emphasis on sequences? And various people, including myself, including Elliot Goldberg, who's sitting over there, have sort of, offered various ideas and reasons for this. But so the discovery of this text is quite key, that there is, apparently, and there was, a lot of experimentation with regard to these, how you would string postures together and do something a bit more sort of aerobic, if you like, a bit more similar to what happens often in yoga classes these days. And this text is also particularly interesting because it was probably known, or a variant of the text, some copy of the text was probably known to a teacher in Mysore in the 1930s called T. Krishnamacharya. We know that he knew a different text called the Sri Tattvaniti, which was a copy, and a kind of garbled copy of this text that describes these sequences, where the scribe or whoever put together this later text, the Sri Tattvaniti, had pulled out, we don't know why, we don't know exactly what he was thinking, but had pulled out all these postures and rearranged them so that sequential nature was lost. But there's reason to think that Krishnamacharya himself might have known actually both these texts, and possibly sort of got the idea for those sequences from this text. And those are the sequences that we sort of inherit these days. A lot of the sort of flow yoga, the dynamic yoga, stems from Krishnamacharya's teachings. or those of his students. So we're sort of working on that. I don't think we can quite say that Krishnamacharya, got those sequences from this ancient source. There, of course, as you know, there's a legend about a lost text called the Yoga Kurunta, which is supposed to be the source for these practices. And it just so happens that this text that we're working on is authored by one Kapala Kuruntaka. And the name Kuruntaka is suggestive of this sort of, this mysterious text, the Yoga Kurunta. So we're working on that. We'll, Jason Birchin and I are currently writing an article, and we'll be putting that out fairly soon. But it's interesting, it's sort of suggestive. Like I don't think enough work has been done on that sort of period between the last text in this book and the beginning of those sort of modern experiments that bring us up to the present day.
It does seem to be only in the modern era that these texts have been mined for instructions on practice by practitioners. They don't seem to be that rich a resource if you were a practitioner, say, 800 years ago, consulting a text that said, sit in the lotus position, put one leg on the other leg, sit for some time. And it's very sparse, the sort of instructions you're getting. And in fact, that Atreya Yoga Shastra, one of the texts that Jim's brought to our attention, talks about how it's all about practice. You're not going to get anywhere by reading the texts. And yet it doesn't actually describe any practice, really. It's very sort of bare bones description. So presumably there was teaching from a guru that was supposed to supplement all this. Are these then kind of the lecture notes on the teachings, or are they somebody else's second-hand understanding of what was shared with the students, or should they be read by practitioners? How do we interpret it?
It's a very good question, and one I don't think I can answer completely. It's sort of something I'm constantly asking myself, is why were these texts written? Because we know, particularly these ones on physical practice, that only started being written about 1,000 years ago. Yeah, as I said, we know from Alexander the Great that people were doing this stuff, 1,500 years before that. So why do they suddenly start getting written down? And what it does say in these texts is that they're sort of, in some ways, introducing these practices to a wider audience. They're saying that people other than these professional ascetics who turn their backs on normal life and dedicate themselves permanently and constantly to the practice of yoga, they're saying that other people, normal people with normal lives can do a bit of yoga. That's the answer I've been giving until recently. But I just recently I was with a scholar, an Indian scholar up in the Himalayas. He lives in a place called Mundi, and he's just written this great book called A Prehistory of Hinduism. And he goes into the sort of political and economical background of the religious traditions during the period when these texts were first written down. And he's not addressing himself to these texts, he's just looking at other things. But as I'm reading this book, I'm thinking, well, this actually is providing the background to the traditions that produce the texts that I work on. And we see this constant tension in the text between this idea of the professional yogi who doesn't have a family, doesn't have a job, and just is constantly practicing yoga, and then the person who lives in the world, as we normally say. And in fact, going back to the Bhagavad Gita that Mark was talking about, and that's the message, that's what's going on in the Bhagavad Gita as well, is that these people, these professional yogis who are kind of symbols of transcendence and saying you don't need to worry yourself with all this pointless, mundane life, you should be concentrating on God. They're a kind of threat to regular society. And so that's the point of the Bhagavad Gita, saying actually you don't need to turn your back on society, you can live in the world and be a yogi at the same time. And that, I think, is what's going on in these texts that start being produced about 1,000 years ago, but it's in a very specific context, whereby the heads, the monastic heads of the lineages, the monasteries start getting given land grants. So they start owning property, they start becoming very rich, and then the way that you pass on that property is through having children. Okay, and so what the texts are doing, they're trying to justify the heads of the monasteries living family lives and having children, and thereby, they don't say this, but this is what I think is going on, because there's a constant argument between whether you need to do the extreme practices or whether you can just live a normal life. And and there are some quite bizarre, yogic techniques which are used to justify this argument. I go back to this point I made about nymphs seducing yogis and thereby they lose all their power. Well, then there are these special yogic techniques which are introduced in these techniques, in these texts, whereby you can, procreate yet not lose your power. And I think this is what's going on.
Yeah, I seem to remember that there's a line in, I think it's the Shiva Samhita, which says, the household that has much fun having mastered these teachings. Bully for him. I'd like to come to a couple of quotations from the book, very brief but seemingly contradictory, at least on the surface. You say towards the beginning that there is by the time that the book is sort of coming to a close, the end of the 18th century, the eve of British colonial rule in India, that there was a pervasive trans-sectarian consensus throughout India as to what constitutes yoga. And then, however, a little bit later when discussing postures, so that actually even in pre-modern India, at the same period, there was no consensus as to which physical practices could be accepted as part of yoga. So that sort of sets up a little bit of a dichotomy between yoga and the physical practices for the one, and then also this makes me wonder, what actually are the common factors in a lot of these texts that make a practice yoga as opposed to stretching or hanging out with your dog or drinking beer, as some of the more modern variants might have it.
That's me.
Well, there is a consensus as to what yoga is, but there's also, the walls, the barriers are permeable, and particularly with asanas, we see a kind of this proliferation that we've been talking about, and in other practices as well, such as these cleansing techniques, which are 6 in that Hatha Pradipika that Jim was talking about, but which also, you start to get other techniques added, how different ways to cleanse the body. And yet there are other there are other techniques like pranayama practice, which stay relatively stable. So you've got 8 pranayama practices in the older text, and you have 8 pranayama practices in most other places. Sorry, breath control. Pranayama is breath control. And so, but that sort of consensus is basically the model of Hatha Yoga that Jim's been talking about. And that starts to become accepted and assimilated into the mainstream from the 16th century onwards, 16th, 17th, 18th century, into, let's say, the Hindu mainstream, and to have new texts produced which sort of fit that practice, which formerly was sort of outside of that structure, into this sort of Vedic Hindu way of life. Particularly one body of text that has been called the Yoga Upanishad, so new texts, not the older Upanishads from, let's say, sort of 2,000 years ago, but a new body of practices which represents this, which brings yoga into that kind of mainstream of life. What was the second bit? It was, what is it that makes it yoga? It seems to, well, it depends who you ask, doesn't it? I mean, it depends who you ask, but usually it depends on initiation. It depends on there aren't any yoga initiations. I think we have one example of a particular yoga initiation, but you would, I think, to study yoga, to practice yoga, you would have to be initiated into a particular lineage, into a particular school. You'd have to belong to that particular school. So even though in some of these texts, like the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, it's said that, well, you can be a Buddhist, you can be you can be Shaiva, you can be Vaishnava, you can be a materialist who doesn't really believe in anything beyond the material body, and yoga will still work. But in practice, I think you would have to actually belong to one of these yoga practicing lineages. And of course, what constitutes yoga tends to change in the modern day, and it seems to me that maybe everybody has a line that they don't cross, but that line varies. Some people will cross over into yoga for dogs. or what was it? Goat yoga? Goat yoga. You know, so those boundaries have become much more permeable, much more flexible, and that sort of key notion of a sampradaya, of a lineage that you would be initiated in which you would remain in, has kind of gone, I think, in the sort of democratic marketplace of yoga that we have today.
Changing the question slightly for Jim, who has been initiated into a traditional lineage and honoured with a title in recognition of his long and faithful service to his guru, perhaps. What is it that is being taught in that context, perhaps, that modern practitioners of yoga in a slightly more urban setting might not be doing? It's obviously difficult to say. I know you like to say you don't go to yoga classes, but at the same time, are there practices or ways of seeing, or even just ways of conceiving of what yoga is, that the average yoga student today might benefit from paying a little bit more attention to?
Yes, I mean, I think so. There are actually, I'm not sure about the sort of goat yoga and the beer yoga. I used to say, until those things appeared, I used to say you can find sort of parallels for just about everything when you look in the history, but I don't think we can. Well, beer yoga actually you can within tantric traditions that will take alcohol and then some, of course. But the goats, I'm not sure about. I'm not quite sure what goat yoga is, but I was asked about it, I was interviewed about it, and I pretended I did, but I don't know. Anyway, the tradition that I'm part of. I mean, there's something that struck me a while ago. I mean, I'm kind of liminal. I occupy a liminal position because it's an ascetic tradition where these people are renouncers and and I go on about it again. No family life. They're itinerant. They don't. They subsist off alms. They'll never work for a living and so forth. And some of them do pretty extreme practices, including. There's one thing, again, which goes back to the time of the Buddha, the time of Alexander. We have some very old references to, in the hot season, so the 4 months of the hot season, they will, in the middle of the day, sit surrounded by burning cow dung fires under the hot sun, and they'll meditate for a couple of hours. And this, again, is part of these practices of asceticism which build up power within the body, and the power is identified as heat. In fact, the Sanskrit word tapas for this power and for these ascetic practices also means heat. And then some of them, at the end of doing that couple of hours it normally is of meditation, and they'll be repeating their mantras and so forth, will do some yoga postures. And something occurred to me the other day, and in fact a friend of mine, a sadhu who's sort of not quite exactly the same lineage, but sort of a cousin of mine effectively, I was speaking to him about it, and he said he only does his yoga postures in the hot season, because that's when the body is supple and able to get into the more advanced position. And I couldn't help but think of Bikram yoga, even though everyone knows about Bikram yoga, where you do it in a hot room and you get very hot and sweaty, and then you can assume more tricky postures. And I don't think Bikram, although he's now run away, he's now gone into hiding because he's in deep trouble, like most of these yoga gurus seem to end up at the end of their careers at some point or other. Anyway, I think he's gone into hiding in India. But at one point he was trying to copyright his whole system, wasn't he? But I don't think he did notice that parallel, that perhaps he could have claimed authenticity with.
It might be a challenge to get people to do that in the same way as washing out their intestines in the river and some of the other practices we see in some of these texts. But just coming back to the modern era now and the project you're working on together at SOAS, wondering if you could give a little flavour of what people can expect in the coming years. What's it about, what you have in mind? You mentioned some translations, but I know there are some other books that you're working on as well, and perhaps a film.
Yeah, okay, so, so as I mentioned, the core outputs of the project are 10 critical editions of texts on physical yoga that have never been published or translated before, so we're working from manuscripts. And then there are 4 of us based at SOAS in London who will each produce a monograph, a book about our sort of specialist areas. We're also, Mark might say a bit about this, but delighted. It's looking pretty likely, I mean almost certain, but we're involved in an exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum, which will probably have, we haven't got a date on it yet, have we, but probably 2020. So we're helping there. It's actually, this is a sort of side effect, a lucky break, thanks to the discovery of that Amrita Siddhi text being Buddhist, because the exhibition is on Tantric Buddhism. So 2 or 3 years ago, they'd never even considered having us on board, but now because of that text, they're justified in getting us involved, and of course they recognise the great interest in yoga. And Mark and I were both involved in the show at the Sackler Gallery of the Smithsonian in 2013, which had 300,000 people came to it, so which was very good for a museum show. So that's another thing we're involved with. And there's the film, so actually maybe Mark's more closely involved with the film than I am, so maybe Mark would like to say something about that.
Well, it's a film of this text that I was talking about called the Hatha Padati, which attempts to put together, to reconstruct these sequences, so for the first time on film. So that is with, again, Jason Birch and his wife, Jacqueline Hargreaves. And we've done it, we filmed it in London during the summer with some advanced Ashtanga yoga practitioners there. And that will be available soon. Some of the postures are so extreme that we couldn't find anybody to do them. So if there's any volunteers, see me afterwards. So some of it will actually be filmed in India, I presume, sometime soon. And it's quite extraordinary. It's quite extraordinary. It doesn't look like the sort of modern sequences that we know today, but it really is quite unique and quite exciting. So there's that.
When Mark says some of the postures will be filmed in India, I think that there are sort of schools of yoga schools for children in India, so you can get some extremely bendy young yogis.
That's what we need.
I think they're the only people we can find who are going to be able to do some of the stuff.
And there's also a practice that's not yoga, but there's a kind of allied practice called Malkamp, which involves doing extreme postures on a stick or a rope. And in this text, I think 10 rope postures are described. So those are also some of the things that we'll be filming in India. We should probably also mention, you've mentioned Daniela Babilacqua, who's the ethnographer on the project, who's spending mostly all of her time in India at the moment, interviewing yoga practicing sadhus. So going around, traveling around to all the melas, all the Kumbh melas that Jim was talking about, trying to get an idea of exactly what it is that people do in the name of yoga in these various lineages, and coming up with some really amazing data that nobody's really sort of thought to do that before. So that will be coming soon as well.
Exciting time to be involved in yoga studies. Well, thank you both very much for giving us an overview of what you've been doing and what we can expect. I'd like to just give everybody perhaps an opportunity to ask a couple of questions, if any come to mind. Please.
So you haven't said anything about chanting? Either of you?
Well, there is a chapter in the book about mantra. So.
The question was we haven't said anything about chanting. As Daniel pointed out, there's a chapter in the book about mantra. I mean, mantra means a sacred syllable. Sometimes there are various different understandings of it. It's not the mantras are actually rarely chanted when, if I think about it, it's normally meant to be repeated mentally. And in fact, as the physical yoga traditions kind of coalesce over the last 1,000 years, they somewhat get rid of mantra practice, and they just say that the in-breath and the out-breath is repeating the mantra Soham, which means I am that, which is the classical sort of Vedantic, one of the philosophical systems of India. It's the mantra of that. So, chanting, in fact, in a traditional setting, is more associated with devotional practice rather than the yoga traditions. But again, that is a method of yoga as well, bhakti yoga, which Krishna taught, and so your chanting would be central to that.
Yeah, you mentioned a little bit about pranayama, and translated as breath control, but I find that a strange translation. Could you go just a little further into what prana might actually mean for your practices and what the control of what prana might mean?
Yeah, so prana is this strange word that, very ancient concept that occurs, well before Hatha Yoga and the sort of pranayama, these breath control practices of Hatha Yoga. And it means it's used in two senses. One is this sort of vital principle, this essence of life, if you like, that flows through all things, particularly living beings. But it also means one of 5 sort of airs that are contained within the body, these winds that are contained in the body and that are controlled and manipulated through practices like breath control, as we call it, pranayama, but also through these other practices like mudra, these seals which sort of direct and position the airs in order to affect usually a kind of upward movement of this prana through the central channel of the body. So for those of you that don't know, the yogic body is quite different to the sort of the biological body. It's not quite the same thing. It's sort of it has its own very complicated history, and in fact is the longest chapter in the book is about these varieties of yogic body. So usually what prana does particularly in certain tantric contexts, in the Hatha Yoga context, is to force this energy, these airs, into the central channel, up through the central channel, and often usually sort of out through the crown of the head. So that's one sort of context for this pranayama practice. Ayam, some people have sort of translated it as sort of expansion. But the practice is they're often, rather than pranayama, they're often referred to as kumbhaka, which means breath retention. So it's really, it seems to be that the retention has a particularly important part to play. It's not just sort of breathing in and out gently. That sort of containing the air and directing the air is what's essential. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just to say, I understand your reservation about the translation of breath control. But what we do, if we look at it historically, which we do in the book, the earliest references to pranayama, it's tied in with this notion of austerity, of kind of extreme bodily practice. And the Buddha himself, the Buddha tried these ascetic techniques, including holding the breath for a very long period of time, till he says the fires were blazing in his stomach, and he reckons there's no way anyone could have gone further than that, but it still didn't get him to his goal. So the Buddha, of course, then stops doing these practices and sits under a tree to attain enlightenment. But it's closely associated with these ascetic sort of methods of tormenting the body, and also within the orthodox Hindu scriptures, the kind of law books from a very early period, it's seen as a penance. If you do something wrong, right, you have to go and do a load of pranayama. You have to go and hold your breath in certain cycles for 100 cycles, 108 cycles, or something like that. And it's only a bit later on, within possibly, I suspect we've lost some sources, and within the later tantric traditions, so the end of the first millennium, but then we see them clearly in the Hatha Yoga text, where you get these more these breath control, or I don't know what to say, but these methods of manipulating the breath which have these higher spiritual aims, these strange ways of inhaling and exhaling and so forth. So I think early on, it's an okay translation, because it really is, it's meant to be sort of control and restraint and uncomfortable, but then later on, perhaps we should rethink the translation there.
In Buddhist and Hindu art, when they use it, like for example, when the Buddha is seeking enlightenment, he's in a position that we call the lotus position. And for example, when Durga is slaying the demon, she's in a position we call the question is, but are we sort of retrofitting these concepts into...
Yes and no. With the lotus position, not at all. That's very much, you know, an ancient pose. In fact, funny enough, I think the earliest reference to the lotus position is in the Kama Sutra, strangely enough, which it's listed among various positions that can be used in lovemaking. But so with that, absolutely not. That's, you know, it's one of the oldest attested seated postures for meditation, or if not the oldest. But I think with the Durga and the Mahishasura Mardini posture, calling that the warrior pose, now that is a retroactive attribution because we get no mention of a warrior pose in any Sanskrit text at all, do we? I don't think. I think the warrior pose is very much unless there was some, you know, obscure tradition that we don't know of and that's not represented in text, which yeah, that's something perhaps we should say is that, you know, we do try and incorporate information from our historical materials and ethnography and all other sources, not just the text. But it's pretty clear that the texts don't tell us everything. So, for example, in Hampi, in the amazing sort of the city in central southern India that was the biggest city in the world in the sort of 15th, 16th century, and there's amazing carvings on lots of temples there. And we see yogis in all sorts of postures which are not described in text at all. So that's a kind of clear sign that there were yoga traditions going on that are not represented by our texts. But I think with the warrior pose, so by the 18th, 19th century, though, just about everything is documented in text, or everything that was going on then. And I'm pretty sure there's no warrior pose in there. There is a virasana, which you might translate as a warrior pose, but it's nothing like that posture.
So following up on what you said, the Buddha in his Dhammasana is actually using yogic techniques, is he not, to achieve nirvana? And this is something that should be obvious to me, but has never been. So I'm wondering if there's a sort of quasi-political reason for downplaying the tradition.
Yeah, I'd like to answer that because that's actually it's a sort of hot topic in Buddhist studies at the moment. Well, not specifically that. I see that as the hot topic. But what?
I'm sorry, Jim. Could you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry. The question is basically saying the Buddha was doing yoga, and that's downplayed. People don't acknowledge that. So just about all of our historical scholarly studies of Buddhism are based on what's called the Pali Canon. So these texts in Pali, which is a kind of, you know, Cockney version of Sanskrit, sort of. That's probably being a bit rude, but anyway, it's a sort of, you know, it's a kind of, yeah, it's a vernacular form of Sanskrit in a way. The oldest manuscripts of any of the texts of the Pali Canon are from the 15th century CE. Okay, so only 500 or 600 years ago. And sure, they're going to preserve some things from 2,000 years earlier, which is when the Buddha lived, but things are pretty certain to have changed. Within the version of the Buddha's life preserved in the Pali Canon is this story that he tried these techniques. I was saying to Rodney about how he held his breath. In fact, he did this, you know, he did something strange with his tongue. He mentions these various things. And then in that version of the story, he decides that they're all rubbish, they're useless, and he goes and sits under the Bodhi tree and gets enlightened. In the last few decades, much older manuscripts, particularly in the northwest of the Indian subcontinent, have been discovered. Manuscripts last much longer there in the drier climate. So in caves in China and also in the northwest of Pakistan, there are now, you know, there are documents, manuscripts from, I think the oldest are just over 2,000 years, and some are just into the first millennium AD. And in those narratives, but they're much more fragmentary. You don't have the whole sort of canon like we do with the Pali canon. But in those tellings of the life of the Buddha, he does these practices, and he stops doing them. He goes and sits under Bodhi tree, but he doesn't say they were rubbish. It's like they're a step on the path. You know, so one might argue. And also from that same region, I think you've probably seen statues of the fasting Buddha. You know, so you see the statue is incredibly gaunt, and his face is totally tucked in, and all his ribs are showing and everything. And that often, you know, I long wondered, if he said that those practices of fasting and breath control and these are more extreme forms of yoga were no good, why would they then depict him doing them? And these all come from the same region as well, where this sort of different textual tradition survives. So, and it's taking a while to filter through into the academy, because the old guard, who have spent their whole careers interpreting the Pali Canon, don't like this at all, because their life's work is being questioned. And so it's kind of a young generation of scholars, younger than I am, but some very good young scholars are kind of, well, no, not all younger than I am, there's one or two, but it's taking a while, but I think in 20 or 30 years that will be the new orthodoxy about the history of the Buddha.
If this is
So you go for the first.
this is kind of factual. If the text had disappeared, would the physical tradition, could the physical tradition have continued?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a sort of, the point I'm trying to make earlier is that we know that the physical practices were going on from 2,500 years ago, but they don't get codified in text until 1,000 years ago. So they're perfectly, they were able to be transmitted over that period. And again, we find, there are things like there's one text from about 1200 that calls the headstand Kapali, which is the Kapala is a word for the skull, so you're standing on your skull. And then this word Kapali doesn't crop up again in any text for about another 600 or 700 years. But it clearly must have been being used in that intervening period. So the text, to a great extent, I think, are adjunct to the tradition, the lineages that are passing down these practices already.
So zooming forward in yoga history, any thoughts on why now? How come yoga has gone global in the last several years?
What's the question?
The question is, why has yoga gone global in the last several years? Well, I suppose yoga's gone global in the last couple of 100 years, as you know, but it's certainly speeding up in the last decades. The reason for that was that India was suddenly opened to, not suddenly, but more open to the world, and was being looked at and studied, and there was a kind of fascination with what was going on in India initially, and many people from Europe and America sort of going there and sort of poking around and saying, "Ooh, what's this?" And so then yoga started to become, that word yoga started to become a kind of household name. People started to get very interested in it. Initially as not something that you would do, but something that you would sort of gawp at. As yoga practitioners were among the most colourful of the religious practitioners in India. So this is a long story, as you know, that I won't go into. But at a certain point, yoga became something that you could actually do. People started to come over from India and teach it, and others started to teach it without any kind of sort of training in yoga. And suddenly you had this sort of expansion and this explosion of yoga. Why now has it become so popular? I don't know. I mean, there have been several sort of explosions in yoga. That first one, sort of towards the end of the 19th century, with a teacher called Vivekananda, who came to New York and remained in New York remained on the East Coast for a number of years, and sort of started this revolution. And then you have the 60s explosion of yoga, which was quite different to the yoga that we see around today. For one thing, there were no lycra pants back in the 60s. There was a different
mats.
Sorry?
Or sticky mats.
Or sticky mats. The sticky mat, in fact, has a very recent history. It came about through, I believe, and maybe there's people here that could speak to this better than I can. It came about because there was this is a story I heard recently in India, that it was one student of BKS Iyengar who had no sweat glands in her hands. This is Angela Farmer. And so requested special permission to use this sticky mat because she couldn't, on the floor, she would slide around all over the place. And lo and behold, now you can't go anywhere without a sticky mat. As to the popularity of yoga, I don't know. I mean, I've speculated in the past as to why, but certainly it seems to answer a deep need. It seems like everybody is doing yoga, and every year the spending on yoga increases, the number of people doing yoga increases according to the surveys. And it also seems to be sort of crash-proof. So the worse the economy gets, the better the yoga economy gets. And perhaps there's something there that in times of great instability, then yoga provides something that's stable, and that sort of answers a need.
Yes, sort of actually follow on from that really. I wonder what the ascetics and the yogis, in as much as they care, make of the yoga that's travelled around the world, and sort of, do they resent it, do they like it, do they capitalise on it?
Jim seems to have found people copying it.
Yes, to some extent. Yeah, I mean they do. They make a distinction actually, because so yoga is a Sanskrit word, and so it's pronounced yoga. But when Sanskrit words are used in vernacular languages in India, they drop the final A. So in Hindi, yoga is not yoga; it's yog. And so the sadhus that I spend time with, they make a distinction between yog, which is what they do, and yoga, which is what's going on in the sort of metropolises in India and in the West. I mean, it's pretty huge in India as well. But I was just, I was there a couple of weeks ago, and I was driving up to the Himalayas, and I'm going through a pretty small town on the village, and there was a sign up for it was weightlift, bodybuilding, and yoga. And I wish I'd stopped and taken a picture. Actually, I was quite surprised. But yeah, they see a distinction between the two. But at the same time, so this project that Mark and I are working on, when we pitched it to the European Research Council, one of the things I to try and underscore the urgency of particularly the ethnographic side of the project. So the Daniela, who was mentioned earlier, who is in India, documenting the practices of traditional yogis, to underscore the urgency of that, because I pointed out how it's changing extremely quickly at the moment because of this, or because we're all so connected now. So there was one yogi in particular that I met, who a young guy, and his lineage, his tradition. I was working on a paper at the time. They are often credited with being the founders of physical yoga practice, but none of them that anyone met did any physical yoga practice. And then I met this guy, and there he was young, he's probably 21, 22, and he did this amazing kind of contortionist bendy routine of yoga postures. And so I think I'm going to have to rewrite this completely. This has really blown my theory out of the water. And I got talking to him, and I asked him, I said, so who's your guru? Who in your lineage taught you these practices? He said, oh, no, came directly to me from Guru Goraknath, who's the sort of 1,000-year-old founder of the sect. And this guy, this was 5 or 6 years ago, and he was pretty useful on his mobile telephone as well, and social media and so forth. And he kept saying to me, if I knew English, I'd be world famous, wouldn't I? And I'm completely convinced that he was looking at modern globalized yoga practice through on TV or through his mobile phone and stuff, and was teaching himself some of the practices like that. So it's changing fast, because it's become this huge global phenomenon, and we're all so connected. It's getting harder and harder to identify the different threads that make it up.
Can you take what you just said and reverse it to the origins of yoga? If you see what I'm saying. In other words, how did it get started in the first place, absent directly from Buddha? It clearly
Yes, that's a good question. The question is, where did it come from? Where did it start? Effectively, so what the kind of consensus these days? I mean, we have a passage from one text, what they call the Atharva Veda, which is the latest of the 4 Vedas, so the most ancient text of Hinduism, probably about 1000 BC. But that's pretty sketchy. There's just a few kind of ideas that we then find in later yoga texts. It's in no way a kind of description of yoga practice. And the first, or what we would understand as yoga practice, when it seems that, the time that it seems that yoga really kind of breaks into comes out, it becomes apparent in Indian history, is around the 4th and 5th centuries BC, when the Buddha lived. And what appears to have happened then is in a region called Magadha, which is just sort of south, it's northern India in the Ganges basin, just south of Nepal. There are these various ascetic traditions which are collectively known as shramanas. That means the strivers, the ones who are striving towards something. And it's amongst those traditions that lots of things developed for the first time in India, including ideas of karma, so that what you do will then affect what happens to you later on, and the associated notion of samsara, so the wheel of transmigration and rebirth. And at the same time, this notion of being constantly reborn over unlimited lives going on forever is then seen as a bad thing, because life is associated with suffering, and I think it probably was in those days probably much more closely associated with suffering, much shorter, a lot more disease going on, famine, and people constantly fighting and so forth. So life was seen as suffering, and these shramanas were devising techniques to break free of this, and that's the notion of enlightenment. And this is the first time that these concepts appear. So they're all coming up with different ways of breaking free of this cycle of suffering, and yoga is one of them. And also, another concept that appears then is ahimsa, which is normally translated as non-violence. So that kind of also to answer your question about diet, that's when this notion of vegetarianism appears, because despite what people may tell you at that time, the Hindu traditions, the word Hindu wasn't used, but what we would now call Hindu traditions, they weren't all vegetarian by any stretch of the imagination. And it's among these kind of yogi ascetic groups that this concept of non-violence, which is therefore creating good karma and then giving you a better reward in later life, that appears. So yeah, it seems to be there.
One last question, if anybody has.
You can go ahead. I feel it's a lot of pressure having the last question. I feel like it might not be up to snuff, but my question is that in the intro to Light on Yoga, Iyengar says that yoga is not extreme. But then when you kind of learn about it, like it really is extreme, I don't know. And then the way it used to be, or it seemed like it used to be here as a practice, the asana practice seemed not extreme. And now lately it's starting to, maybe just to me, but it's starting to seem extreme. And it's like, I'm wondering, is it extreme or is it not?
I mean, Mark could maybe answer more about what's going on there, but that's absolutely the tension that I'm getting at, that we find within the text that represent the tradition. There is this constant kind of tension between, is this a sort of method of bodily mortification, or is it a thing for cultivating the body? Do you scorn the body? Do you think it's a horrible sort of bag of, you get this text saying it's a horrible bag of phlegm and pus and fat, and you don't want this thing at all, and it's to be transcended. Or you get other texts which say, through these practices we will make it perfect, and we can live like divine beings. And so, you're just perpetuating the tension between the two. And I can't give you an answer either way. I mean, I think that what one can take from the tradition is that one can choose either. The argument continues to go on. So neither approach is wrong or right. Both are right.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think there is a tradition that's critical of these difficult practices, these tapas practices, or of hatha yoga in general, where these people say that there's no point doing difficult practices because you can attain to the same goal in much easier ways through these practices which are easy, which often involve sort of, well, sitting down and say, looking at one spot for a long time, or just, relaxing the mind. And the analogy that's drawn in one of the texts is how to corral a beast. One way is to go out there with a stick and start shouting and start, sort of hitting and dragging the animal back in, which is going to take you a long time. You're going to be sweaty, you're going to be exhausted. The other method is to go out there with a handful of grass and talk to the animal very gently, and sort of scratch it behind its ear and gradually lead it in. So there's much less effort, but the goal is the same. So as Jim's saying, that tension is still here. And as to why practices have, posture practices have apparently gotten much harder since that sort of second wave that I was thinking about that I was talking about during the 60s. Well, who's to know? I don't know. I wonder if it sort of matches a sort of the impression that life should be hard, that life needs to be sort of that in order to get anywhere you need to work hard, no pain, no gain. That sort of mantra may be filtering through into yoga as well.
Could it be Instagram?
I was going to say, it's about the display of what you're doing as much as it is about the performance side of it has become such a big part. Anyway, thank you all for coming. Thank you for being
Thank you, Daniel, as well, very much for jumping in at the last minute.
First of all, I'm not temperamental. Yes, it's a big deal being here. And on Monday will be the second time. Oh, never mind. Holding hands on the street. That's what it is. Bye. See you tomorrow.
Where do you think I put my coat? Literally, maybe